Make 'em laugh, make 'em laugh. Don't you know everyone loves to laugh? Ha ha! My dad said, be an actor, my son. But be a comical one, they'll be standing in lines for those old honky-tonk monkey shines. Now you can study Shakespeare and be quite elite, and you could charm the critics and have nothing to eat. Just slip on a banana, peel the world at your feet. Make 'em laugh, make 'em laugh, make 'em laugh! Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I'm coming in with my latest weekend of double features, and while you may be wondering, well, Ian, where were you last week? Look, I'm trying to get more consistent with this channel, but you know, sometimes you drive up to Philly to see a new international independent film, and you have a lean, off-the-beaten-path pick to discuss with your open-minded audience. And sometimes you don't use a parking garage because you're already late to your first showtime, so you just park on the street right across from the theater. And sometimes you're late anyway, so the kindly theater worker promises to honor your ticket for a later showtime. So sometimes you just decide you're going to go grab a burger and a drink while you wait. And then sometimes you come back to the theater and notice that your car has been impounded by the city of Philadelphia because despite the fact that you already paid to be in a designated parking area, you didn't see that you were parked in a handicapped zone because the sign indicating such is covered by low-hanging foliage. So you have to spend the rest of your afternoon and evening, not to mention in excess of $500, trying to get your dumb ass home. So I'm coming to you with my latest weekend of double features. Queued up for these next two episodes, we've got Final Destination Bloodlines. This is the 6th entry in the Final Destination franchise, originally created all the way back at the turn of the new millennium by writer and producer Jeffrey Reddick. Followed by Hurry Up Tomorrow, a psychological thriller with a slight musical twist. This is directed and co-written by Trey Edward Schultz, and is a collaboration between Schultz and star Abel Tesfaye, aka The Weeknd. This film serves as a companion piece for Tesfaye's latest album of the same name. And that may not strike some of my viewers as a very elegant double feature selection, but honestly, while I didn't necessarily find the kind of thematic serendipity I really want from a double feature movie night, please see my previous video on my double featuring of The Surfer and Bonjour Tristesse. I certainly felt like the pairing of, on the one hand, a legacy sequel to one of the new millennium's most consistently popular teen horror franchises, filled to the gnarly brim with gallows humor taken at the expense of the horrific, elaborate deaths of others. And on the other hand, for however it serves as far as Tesfaye's own interests as a multimedia artist and a pop star, the latest film from, in my opinion, one of the best contemporary American auteurs to emerge from the boom in middle-brow, artsier genre films that came into vogue in the mid-2010s, and for whatever anyone else is saying about it, serving up on its own another simmering, aesthetically hypnotic, and largely experiential vision of psychological extremes. I don't know, maybe I really did find some thematic serendipity that makes this a solid affirmative recommendation as a double feature, because I'm gonna level with a lot of you out there, and maybe you've gotten a sense of this from my reviews of horror movies in general. I don't really go to horror movies to be scared. Quite frankly, I don't think even most horror fans go to horror movies to be scared. And it's not just because after a while you start to inure yourself from the feelings you used to get as a young kid, where even something like catching Puppet Master versus demonic toys on late night Sci-Fi Channel was enough to give you nightmares. It really isn't just that. I think I still get surprised when I meet people who say they don't like horror movies because they don't like to be scared. Because as a guy whose favorite species of film, the one that I think has the most fascinating history, the most diversity, to say nothing of some of the most incredible demonstrations of unique artistic vision in cinematic history, for a guy who loves horror movies as much as I do, I can only hear that and be like, you're scared by horror movies? Look, I might be a snob, but I'm not a poser. I freely admit that sometimes even a really rudimentary jump scare can get me really good. But for the most part, I don't go into a contemporary horror movie looking to feel scared or even shocked per se. I'm too far down the river for that at this point in my life. I've literally seen too much. And I haven't just seen too much from horror movies, I've seen too much from, like, life. The world. At a certain point, even for the most ardent horror fan, the inherent absurdity becomes the point. If I get scared or disturbed by a film experience, it's largely independent of the superficial genre category. I found myself very often way more disturbed by documentaries and dramas, whereas I primarily go to horror movies to have a good laugh. And sure, sometimes I still do get surprised when a horror movie is like, actually scary or disturbing. But for the most part, it might not even be just a I'm used to it thing. Going all the way back to Georges Méliès and the early silent cinema of attractions, in which that first movie magician would create vaudevillian comedies out of depictions of haunted houses and the devil in hell, all the way through the golden age of American horror films, where so many of these productions, despite very often being quite scary, almost always themselves evinced a black comic, even self-referential sense of humor. To the teen-geared schlock of the 50s and 60s, to the explosion of exploitation film cinema throughout the 70s, to the revival of self-referential horror in the 80s, all the way to when the first Final Destination was released, at a critical crossroads between the revival in teen horror of the late 90s and the advent of torture porn in the new millennium. Horror has always been predominantly, at least primarily, a genre that thrives on the nestled desire by a significant minority of the box office to see strange, elaborate spectacles of creeping terror and horrific death, not because you really care about being scared, but because the absurdity is amusing, because the gallows spectacle is funny. So you get that with Final Destination Bloodlines, whereas as a pairing with it, Hurry Up Tomorrow is exactly the sort of film that I really had no reason to think would be a good companion piece to that sort of run-of-the-mill, low-stakes, frivolous weekend horror flick, but ended up being far more viscerally disturbing to me than anything I see in even most exceptionally made horror movies, because what it envisions and depicts speaks to something that is not absurd, is not remote, and is even, in its own heightened way, depicting something terrifying about human nature or the state of the world that the elaborate black comic glory of death exemplified in the traditions of horror is there to liberate us from, to provide us with an escape from the things we're scared of in reality. If you're the type of person who generally avoids horror movies because you don't like to be scared, you might want to start, because inuring yourself to the obvious absurdities of a run-of-the-mill horror film, in my opinion, is going to go a long way to getting you to be more attentive to the sorts of things that you should actually be afraid of, like, say, toxic masculinity. But I'm gonna have to reserve any more discussion about what made Hurry Up Tomorrow such a uniquely disturbing experience for me, because, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. I'm gonna need a whole video for that one. So let's just get back to basics with Final Destination Bloodlines, which stars Caitlin Santa Juana as Stephanie, a high-achieving college student who is facing academic probation and the loss of her scholarship because she is plagued by an elaborate recurring nightmare in which she sees, through the eyes of a young woman from the late 60s named Irene, a disaster at the opening night of a revolving sky restaurant in which everyone is horribly killed. Discovering that Irene is actually the name of her family's estranged grandmother, the desperate Stephanie seeks out and finds Irene now living in solitude in a fortified cabin deep in the mountains, where she reveals that Stephanie's dream was actually a premonition she experienced that night way back in 1968, only for Irene to avert disaster and save the lives of everyone there. But when you cheat death, death gets messy, and in true franchise fashion, Irene reveals that the the specter of death has been hounding the survivors of the disaster ever since, and that should the Grim Reaper ever catch up to the vigilant Irene herself, it will soon be her descendants that inherit the wrath of cruel death deferred. Which of course brings us to the classic archetypes of Greek mythology. Now, wait, hold on, let me finish. I know, I can't go a single review just talking about even the most simple strain of good old-fashioned dumb horror movie without getting in over my head. But isn't that kind of the secret, the kind of special sauce of what has helped Final Destination persevere for this long? I'm neither the best nor the worst person to just review Final Destination Bloodlines, because I'm not so much a ride or dyer for the franchise. I've honestly only seen the first and third movie, and when I was much younger, and the primary memory I have of the latter is just that awesome tanning bed sequence. You can even look that up on YouTube and see exactly what I mean. But I'm not the worst person to judge this film either, especially if I'm just doing my best as a film critic to talk to people who are also not ride or dyers for the Final Destination franchise. So good news, you will not have to know anything about the previous films to enjoy this one. You can go into it blind and have faith that the writers and directing team of this film, who are not connected in any way to the original trilogy, have faithfully put their own unique spin on the series, come up with their own ingenious, Rube Goldberg-esque death scenarios for the ensemble of young people, and that they carry it all off with an accessible sense of humor that honestly, even fans of the previous films might be surprised by, as even with my limited experience of the series in my youth, this is definitely a Final Destination for a new generation. The black comedy at work here is a lot more on the nose, which you absolutely understand once you get to the point that the cast has been to the funerals of like 3 separate key family members in the course of like a week, 2 weeks, maybe. In the now generation-spanning saga of Final Destination, though, there is still an opportunity for us as film viewers to go beyond mere appreciation of spectacle and realize, even if it wasn't necessarily intended by the filmmakers, there's a lot going on under the hood of these films, not only in terms of the grand tradition of horror's spectacle of gallows humor, but in terms of fundamental philosophical questions that, much like Stephanie's own nightmares, have plagued the collective imagination of Western culture since antiquity. There's, of course, the Oedipal dimension to this story, and no, I don't mean that anybody in this movie wants to kill their father and marry their mom. I mean the way in which Bloodlines continues the Final Destination series' very interesting, spectacular play with that theme of fate. Fundamental questions about whether we as human beings really do have free will, or if we are trapped in a predestined arc that is determined not just by circumstance, but in fact by our own illusions of free will. Of course, the myth of Oedipus, which becomes a parable in this context, is not really about the psychosexual perversion on the spectacular surface of the myth. Rather, the tragedy of the story lies beneath that spectacle, because Oedipus, ironically, does not kill his father and marry his mother because of circumstance. It is foretold to him that he will do this, he runs away from home, and then makes a series of decisions he is convinced are demonstrative of his attributes of nobility of purpose and destiny to be a king and hero himself, worthy of the Elysium of Greek myth, only to discover that it is his very actions, in terror of his foretold fate, that leads him directly into the jaws of tragedy, and of course, not the least bit, a violent spectacle when he gouges out his own eyes in shame. It is not because it is foretold that the prophecy is fulfilled. Rather, the prophecy is foretold because it must be fulfilled, which is something that the writers of Bloodlines actually channel rather ingeniously with the premise of their spin on the Oedipal template of Final Destination. It would be a mistake to conclude that it is because Irene and Stephanie receive their premonitions that they succumb to their fate. They receive these premonitions because it is their own unyielding sense of their own freedom of will, their own ambition, that death as the invisible foe preys upon to get the gears of tragedy in motion. And what would this series be also without the myth of Sisyphus, the king who twice cheats death, only to be condemned in Hades to a punishment far worse than mere death itself, to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity. As they say in the film, when you with death, death gets messy. And it is, in fact, the character's fear of death that directly leads them into a scenario more horrific than if they had just accepted their fates. Which leads me to perhaps the cutest moment in an otherwise entirely gallows film, which is a cameo performance by the late great B horror star Tony Todd, reprising his role from the first film in what turned out to be, poetically, his final acting role before his passing. Whereas in the original film, Todd is playing basically a dour mouthpiece for exposition, Todd in this film is given a veritable soliloquy in which he implores the desperate ensemble, and thus his audience, to live without fear, to take the lesson of Oedipus and Sisyphus that the only real way to reckon with the terrors of life and death is to simply appreciate the brevity of life all the more. A lot of legacy horror sequels in recent years have featured similar cameos, but the vast majority of them, I'm looking at you, Exorcist believer, come off as quite cynical in contrast to this earnest send-off to a great B actor, and which gives this visceral, sickening carnival of elaborate gore an ironic patina of human frailty and appreciation, giving the story just the right amount of emotional dimensionality it needs so that the redundancy of that carnival of elaborate gore doesn't get too tiresome. And I say too tiresome because while I appreciate a lot of what the creative team of Bloodlines has carried off here, it must be said the various Rube Goldberg death traps are not that great, or at least not that diverse. Basically, the creative team behind this film gets stuck in a rut of pretty much only finding ways to crush and or obliterate people horribly. And I would be the last person to take away from the filmmakers the joy of just seeing bodies get blowed up real good. But there's a reason that, and I don't think I'm alone in this, the tanning bed sequence in Final Destination 3 sticks out so large in the history of the franchise. There are just so many more interesting ways to die, and to die elaborately, than just getting your face ground down by a lawnmower, or being crushed by a machine, or having various metal objects missiled into your skull. There's so much that's just left on the back burner here. Like burning, like asphyxiation, like boiling or melting or being eaten. The reason Final Destination is kind of such a critical franchise in the development of contemporary horror is because, again, it's kind of this transitional franchise between the slasher revival of the late 90s and the much pilloried torture porn of the new millennium. The 70s and 80s and 90s were certainly not without their own spectacles of cathartic, elaborate death. But when it comes to the slasher franchises that dominated horror for so long, the spectacle was really more of a sportsman-like thing, where you're veritably cheering on your preferred mascot of splatter, especially in the 80s, where it's hard to not consider a character like Jason Voorhees in the same context as John Rambo. These characters are anti-heroic vehicles for liberating our buried desire to see our deepest, darkest, most violent sense of grievances loosed upon a convenient fictional target. But Final Destination is much different, owing far more to the spectacular, elaborate deaths in Italian giallo and supernatural horror, especially the work of Dario Argento, where death itself is the omnipresent, invisible villain, and where the spectacle, leading directly to the torture porn genre, speaks to a far gnarlier, grievous millennial fascination with the body in a state of total abjection and contortion and mutilation, where there is no anti-heroic agent, and we are merely finding ourselves fascinated by the most visceral, corporeal dimensions of what humans and our humanity as spectators can be reduced to through the same appeal to our buried, abhorrent desires. And I'm afraid that the creatives of Bloodlines, while they certainly pull off some good work that stands on its own while not having to have any familiarity with the franchise, It's still a creative far cry from what the creators of the original trilogy, which tellingly were X-Files alumni James Wong and Glenn Morgan, what they were able to achieve by combining their own intuition about the spectacular possibilities of elaborate death with a more cerebral instinct for actually exploring the dimensions, not just of gore, but of death. Still, Bloodlines is a well-acted, largely well-written and directed, fun Saturday night crowd-pleasing spectacle in the great tradition of horror as what it mostly is, which is as a comedy of the most gallows humor. I'm giving it a 3 out of 5. With that, I'm tapping out, but please join me again when I come back to you with the companion piece to that well-trod Saturday night crowd pleaser, that, of course, being Hurry Up Tomorrow, which, while not a horror movie, I found, genuinely disturbing, even evil to a low-key degree. But that can wait. Thank you so much for sticking through this video. Don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.